Welcome to Module 1 of our course on Contemporary Strategic Studies. In this module, we will lay the foundation for understanding modern strategy by examining the key concepts, doctrines, and policies that define global security since the end of the Second World War. We begin with core strategic ideas: brinkmanship, containment, massive retaliation, flexible and gradual response, deterrence, and saturation. These were not just abstract theories but living policies that guided nations, influenced conflicts, and shaped the structure of international relations during the Cold War. After introducing these doctrines, we will trace the evolution of strategic and military policy from 1945 onwards, with special attention to the United States, the Soviet Union, Western Europe, and China. By the end of this module, you should have a strong grasp of the intellectual frameworks and strategic choices that dominated global politics in the second half of the 20th century. 1. Contemporary strategic concepts. Let us begin with the strategic concepts themselves. These are ideas developed by political leaders, military thinkers, and statesmen to guide action in times of tension or conflict. 1.1 Brinkmanship. Brinkmanship is the practice of pushing a dangerous situation to the very edge of disaster in order to achieve a favorable outcome. The term is closely associated with U.S. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles during the 1950s. In essence, brinkmanship relies on convincing the opponent that one is willing to go to war, even nuclear war, unless demands are met. By operating at the edge of conflict, one side seeks to force the other into backing down. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 is perhaps the most famous example of brinkmanship, where the United States and the Soviet Union stood on the verge of nuclear confrontation, yet eventually stepped back after achieving negotiated settlements. While brinkmanship can yield results, it is an extremely dangerous strategy because it carries the risk of miscalculation. 1.2 Containment. Containment was the central strategic doctrine of the United States throughout the Cold War. First articulated by George F. Kennan in 1947, containment was designed to prevent the spread of Soviet influence and communism. Rather than directly rolling back the Soviet Union, the United States sought to limit its expansion, both militarily and ideologically. This doctrine led to U.S. involvement in numerous conflicts, including Korea, Vietnam, and Afghanistan, where the overarching aim was to prevent perceived communist takeovers. Containment also justified American alliances such as NATO in Europe and bilateral agreements in Asia. It was not simply a military doctrine but also an economic and political strategy, as seen in the Marshall Plan, which sought to strengthen Western Europe against Soviet influence. 1.3 Massive retaliation. In the 1950s, the Eisenhower administration embraced the doctrine of massive retaliation. Under this strategy, the United States pledged to respond to any Soviet aggression with overwhelming nuclear force. The logic was that the threat of an enormous response would deter even minor acts of aggression. Massive retaliation was intended to provide security at a lower cost, reducing the need for large conventional forces. However, the doctrine soon revealed its weaknesses. Would the United States really launch nuclear weapons in response to a small-scale Soviet move in Europe or Asia? This credibility gap limited its effectiveness. 1.4 Flexible and gradual response. By the 1960s, the Kennedy administration recognized the limitations of massive retaliation and adopted a new approach: flexible response. Flexible response emphasized the need for a range of military options, conventional, tactical nuclear, and strategic nuclear, to match the level of aggression. Instead of automatically resorting to nuclear weapons, the United States sought the ability to fight limited wars, as demonstrated in Vietnam. This approach also stressed alliances and partnerships, making NATO forces more adaptable and responsive to different types of threats. 1.5 Deterrence. Deterrence lies at the heart of strategic thinking in the nuclear age. Deterrence is the prevention of war by the threat of unacceptable retaliation. The idea is simple: if both sides know that initiating war will bring catastrophic consequences, neither will risk starting it. This logic created what became known as mutually assured destruction, MAD, the condition in which both superpowers possessed enough nuclear weapons to destroy each other completely. Deterrence required not just weapons but also credibility. A nation had to convince its rival that it had both the capacity and the willingness to retaliate. Deterrence remains relevant today, even as strategies adapt to new actors and technologies. 1.6 Saturation. The concept of saturation refers to overwhelming an opponent's defenses with such a volume of weapons or attacks that they cannot all be intercepted. In nuclear strategy, this meant deploying enough missiles that some would inevitably get through even if the enemy had sophisticated anti-missile defenses. Saturation underpinned the arms race of the Cold War, as both the US and the Soviet Union sought to ensure that no missile defense system could undermine their deterrent. 2. Evolution of strategic and military policy since 1945. With these doctrines in mind, let us now examine how strategic and military policies evolved after 1945, focusing on key powers. 2.1 The United States. For the US, the immediate post-war years were marked by containment and the building of alliances. With its economic strength and nuclear monopoly until 1949, the United States initially enjoyed superiority. But once the Soviet Union acquired nuclear weapons, US strategy shifted to deterrence and massive retaliation, followed by flexible response in the 1960s. The Vietnam War highlighted the difficulties of applying strategic theory to complex political conflicts, leading to debates over limited war and counterinsurgency. By the 1980s, under President Reagan, US strategy emphasized military buildup, the Strategic Defense Initiative, and renewed confrontation with the Soviet Union. 2.2 The Soviet Union. The Soviet Union pursued its own version of containment, aiming to consolidate its sphere of influence in Eastern Europe and expand its ideological reach globally. Soviet strategy emphasized large conventional forces, nuclear parity with the US, and the promotion of revolutionary movements abroad. From the late 1960s, the Soviets adopted a policy of détente with the West, though competition never fully ceased. Their intervention in Afghanistan in 1979 demonstrated both their ambitions and the limits of their power. 2.3 Western Europe. For Western Europe, strategy was closely tied to NATO and reliance on the American nuclear umbrella. Britain and France developed their own nuclear forces, partly to ensure independence from US policy. France, under Charles de Gaulle, pursued a distinctive approach with its force de frappe. European strategy also focused on balancing economic recovery with defense, leading to a gradual integration of military planning through NATO structures. 2.4 China. China followed a unique path. After 1949, Mao Zedong's China aligned with the Soviet Union, but by the 1960s, ideological and strategic rifts created the Sino-Soviet split. China emphasized a strategy of people's war, leveraging its vast manpower and revolutionary zeal. By 1964, China had acquired nuclear weapons, shifting its position in global strategy. In later decades, China adopted a policy of minimum deterrence, focusing on maintaining a credible nuclear force without entering an arms race. Conclusion to Module 1. In this module, we have surveyed the major strategic concept of the Cold War era, from brinkmanship to deterrence, and examined how the United States, the Soviet Union, Western Europe, and China developed their military and political strategies after 1945. These doctrines were not isolated theories but powerful tools that guided policy, shaped alliances, and sometimes led nations to the brink of disaster. Understanding these foundations is essential as we move forward, because in Module 2 we will examine how weapons technology transformed these strategies, how Soviet reforms such as perestroika and glasnost reshaped global politics, and how strategic thought evolved in the post-Cold War era.